So we left off with the Ottoman Empire entering the First World War, just to remind you, on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, so one of the central powers. Mostly a case of enemy of my enemy is my friend. The chief enemies being Russia for sure, but also France and Britain, both of which had been for much of the preceding almost a preceding century, interfering to a great extent within Ottoman territory, had very, very strong imperial interests there. Britain, of course, with the Suez Canal. French, very strong economic interests in Syria, had been very active intervening on behalf of the Maronites. So it kind of made sense, if you were going to enter the war, to enter in opposition to them. Having said that, almost immediately there was a consideration that the Ottoman Empire probably wouldn't survive the war. And so particularly for Britain, this meant a kind of revising its long-standing policy of trying to maintain the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. And Britain in particular would become very active in negotiating various accommodations with other parties. And that leads us to a story I like to call A Tale of Three Documents. And hopefully you recall that I handed out a number of primary sources, three of which are actual copies of these documents. The first, the Hussein McMahon correspondence; the second, the Sykes-Picot Agreement; and then third, the Balfour Declaration, in each case involving the British and a different second party. So let's consider each in turn. The Hussein McMahon correspondence refers to a series of letters that ran between a fellow named McMahon, who represented British authority in the Sudan, and on the other side, Hussein Bin Ali, the Sharif and Emir of Mecca, beginning from 1908. And this was actually almost, you could say, an official Ottoman position. He was responsible for maintaining the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, in part based on the understanding that he was a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, hence the title Sharif, and also a member of the same clan, the Hashemite. And so at some point the British are going to begin negotiating with him as a representative of Arab nationalism. And so, why were the British doing this? At some point they thought it made sense if they could encourage an Arab uprising against Ottoman authority as a way of kind of undermining the Ottoman war effort. And the question almost immediately was, who can we negotiate that actually represents the Arabs? So a good question here might be, did Hussein bin Ali actually represent Arab nationalists? And on the face of it, one is inclined to say, well, it doesn't seem that he would. Certainly there's very little to indicate that he was a committed supporter of Arab nationalism, and perhaps was motivated more by his own desire to establish himself as the ruler of any future Arab state, or at least the Hijaz, the region around Mecca and Medina. But as a matter of fact, he was in communication with Arab nationalist organizations based in Syria. And they were actually suffering tremendously under the Ottoman governor there, who had actually started executing Arabs who he felt were, traitorous towards the Ottoman Empire. And so, in essence, when he was negotiating with the British, he was actually, to some degree, taking his talking points from Arab nationalists in Syria. So we could say that he, in some fashion, represented the Arab cause. And on the other side, McMahon definitely represented British authority. I mean, he wasn't doing anything without first consulting with London. And so, eventually it was kind of a quid pro quo. The British wanted an Arab uprising or Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. In return, the Arabs wanted British, i.e. great power, support for an independent Arab state or confederacy of states after the war. And so much of the correspondence was actually involved negotiating over which territories the British were prepared to support as part of an Arab independent state or collection of states. And at some point the British indicated, and here we see a passage from the actual correspondence, right? It's a series of letters. So this particular letter was written on October 24th, 1915 from McMahon. where he said the British do not recognize certain portions lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo as being purely Arab. And therefore, they were not prepared to support it as part of an Arab state. Right? So if we draw a line through those cities, right, and bear in mind it says districts, not cities, so there's a bit of an open question about how far we should draw that lines southward. I don't think there's much disputing that the British did not consider what today is Lebanon to be somehow Arab, and that probably does reflect a recognition of French interests. Later on, though, what would become debatable is whether the British also meant to exclude Palestine, what on that map that you see in front of you is Israel. And, again, this comes down to exactly what do we mean by district. Later on, the British would claim that they based on this correspondence, they never supported an independent Arab state in Palestine. And of course, the Arabs would see it differently. We should note that as when what would be called the Arab Revolt actually took place, and as it moved northward from Arabia into Palestine, certainly Arabs in Palestine were encouraged to join the revolt, and they were made to understand they were fighting for their own freedom. So it does feel a bit kind of ingenious that the British later on were arguing that they never meant to include Palestine. We should also note that Hussein never agreed to either what today is Lebanon or Israel, the territory corresponding to that, somehow being omitted from an Arab state. But at some point it was kind of agreed to disagree. There was a need to get the Arab Revolt underway, and it finally began on June 5th, 1916, when Sharif Hussein declared the Arabs independent of Ottoman rule. The figure on the right is one of a number of British officers who would be part of the leadership of that revolt, which was primarily under Sharif Hussein and his sons, one of whom was a fellow named Faisal, but there were some British officers that were fairly prominent. One of them, T.E. Lawrence. Some of you might be familiar with. He would become a very romanticized figure and subject of many films, so some of you might be familiar with the film Lawrence of Arabia, based on that. Mostly they were fighting alongside the British Army, which as it made its way northward, they would be very active, for instance, blowing up rail lines and things of that nature. Now the second document of interest here, SykesPicot, reflected British route, what they wanted, and mostly it corresponded to territories that were part of the Arab lands or parts of the Ottoman Empire. And so this would lead to the SykesPicot Agreement of 1916, Sykes being the British representative in the negotiations, Picot the French one. And so basically they were dividing up the Arab territories between them based on where they considered to have their respective interests. The blue zones would be under French control, the red under British. You'll note that what roughly corresponds to Palestine, later Israel-Palestine, was designated an international zone out of recognition of its religious importance to many different peoples, not just Christians, but also Jews and Muslims. Regarding the blue and red zones, the light blue and light red supposedly corresponded to some kind of independent Arab entity that would be heavily under British and French influence. The dark blue and dark red would be under direct French and British control. The dark blue would be under French control, the dark red under British. But even we should note, I mean, the territories that were in some sense supposed to be independent would be really no more independent than what we saw happen in Egypt with the 4 reserve points, right? Though that's yet to come, this being 1916. I further want to note that this is a secret agreement. So in principle, the Arabs had no idea that this negotiation was taking place. Certainly, I think it is reasonable to see it as contradicting what had been promised the Arabs in the Hussein-McMahon correspondence. So the British would later try to argue that somehow it was compatible. There's some debate over whether some in the Arab leadership of the Arab Revolt might have been made aware of this document in an informal way. We really have no evidence of that. We do know that everyone would be aware of it in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks, when they took over the government in Moscow came across a copy of this agreement the Russians had been made privy to and decided to publish it as a way of embarrassing the British and French. And as you might expect, there was tremendous outrage among many Arabs, feeling that they had been kind of double-crossed. And then finally we have the third agreement, and the British are clearly on a roll here, so why stop? So they also negotiate something called the Balfour Declaration, in this case with the World Zionist Organization. So very quickly, a word on Zionism. The probably simplest definition would be Jewish nationalism. It's a movement that developed starting in East Europe, but then is spreading to other parts in the late 19th century, and basically the idea that the Jews constitute a nation and therefore aren't entitled to a state. Initially much more popular in East Europe, probably because Jews were never really invited to become part of whatever national identity was evolving in that part of the world. For instance, in Russia, they were never really seen as potentially being part of the Russian nation. Very different situation than what you had in, say, France, in the German territories, later the state of Germany, in Britain, where if you were Jewish, you were kind of invited to become part of the nation, and then being Jewish really just became compartmentalized as your religious identity. So first, to make clear, Zionism is very much a secular movement, right? The idea that the Jews are a nation. They do kind of use the Bible as a kind of historical source, right, as a way of constructing the national history of the Jewish people. And related to that, the idea that they should have a state tended to focus on, we might call it the Holy Land, but more or less what corresponded to Palestine. All right, so now with the Balfour Declaration, the British are indicating their support for Zionism and for the idea that the Jews should have some kind of political status in Palestine. Right, so I should note the word Balfour refers to the name of the foreign minister at the time, but let's be clear, this represents British policy. It's promulgated on November 2nd, 1917, at which point the British military had occupied Palestine, which at that point was considered to include what today is the state of Jordan. But I want to look at this closely, right? So reading the text, it says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. What is a national home? Well, this is a very diplomatic way of keeping it as intentionally vague as possible, right? I mean, if you're a Zionist, it could mean eventually, the idea that Palestine should become a Jewish state. If you're a British official speaking to a concerned Arab resident of Palestine, you might say, well, it might just mean that the Jews have some kind of political status within Palestine, or maybe some part of Palestine would be a Jewish state, right? So this is intentional. It's intentionally vague. Further down, you'll notice that it indicates that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Let us consider, first of all, that there is no reference to Palestinian Arabs, right? They are referred to as the non-Jewish communities, which is in essence to deny that they actually constitute a nation, whether as part of the Arab nation or as a distinct subset of that. Also, it makes mention of civil and religious rights, but not of political rights. And again, that is not by accident, that is by design. Finally, at the very end, it says, nothing shall be done to undermine the political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. And that reflected a real fear among many Jews that if you promote the idea that the Jews are a nation, you are in effect undermining the fact that they had been assimilated into the various countries where they resided, that somehow they didn't belong and were not fully Americans or French or British. And related to this, we might note that actually the vast majority of Jews at this point do not support Zionism. Some are actually concerned that it's going to undermine many of the hard-won rights that they had achieved and progress that they had achieved in the various countries where they lived. And we might also point out that at this point, maybe 10% of the population of Palestine is Jewish, right? So they very much constitute a minority. Some of them are Zionists who, during the 3 decades before the First World War, had started to settle in Palestine. But anyway, they make up a very small part of the population. In any event, at the end of the First World War, there would be a peace conference in Paris to arrive at final settlements. Related to this, particularly if we're considering developments in the Middle East, we need to refer to one more document, Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points. And so this, Woodrow Wilson, of course, being the American president, and the one who brought the United States into the war, something that most Americans were opposed to, and he had to provide a justification for his decision to bring us into the conflict. So the 14 points basically outlined his plan for a new international order after the war, the idea being that there needed to be some kind of nobler cause for entering the war. So this was first delivered before the American people at a joint session of Congress, but then later would form the foundation for the negotiations at the Paris Peace Conference, or at least in the minds of many of those attending. There are 2 points in particular I'd like to highlight. The first, open covenants of peace openly arrived at, after which there shall be no private international understandings of any kind, but diplomacy shall proceed always frankly and in the public view, basically outlawing secret negotiations, of which the SykesPicot Agreement is one. So in principle, that agreement should have been null and void at the Paris Peace Conference. But as we're going to see, it actually would influence the eventual outcome with respect to the Middle East. The other point, point 5, a free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims based upon a strict observance of the principle that in determining all such questions of sovereignty, the interests of the populations concerned must have equal weight with the equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined. Basically, the idea that when the great powers were deciding what should be the final fate of any territory, colonial territories, former territories of the Ottoman Empire, the interests of the peoples living in those places should be taken into consideration. In fact, they should have the final say. The broader principle basically is one of national self-determination, right? That the various peoples, in this case of the former Ottoman Empire, should have the right to determine their own political future. In essence, that they shouldn't become colonies. In any event, the Paris Peace Conference would feature representatives of the great power. American body, usually referred to as the King-Creon Commission, a reference to the 2 individuals who led it. And again, it would be made up entirely of Americans. And so it set off in 1919 to the Ottoman Empire, to the former Arab territories, to find out what is it they actually desired. Actually not just the Arab territories, but we're kind of focused on that. And what they found out there is that most of the people wanted complete independence as ideally a unified Arab state under the leadership of Faisal, who at this point had set up a rather rudimentary Arab government in Damascus, even though he was in Paris right at this point, arguing the Arab case for independence. They did indicate, though, that if there had to be any kind of foreign control, which they hoped would be minimal, it should come first from the Americans. And at this point, the United States had really been very minimally active in the Middle East, so it had a pretty good reputation. After that, they would consider British control, and that to some degree reflected the fact that the British were already militarily in control of most of the Arab territories of the former Ottoman Empire. But under no circumstances did they want the French. Right? And the French had made it clear they had a very strong interest in Syria and Lebanon, or territories that would eventually become those states. They even had promoted the idea that they would be welcomed there. This commission made it clear that that wasn't the case. Finally, we should note that when they spoke to representatives of the Arab population in Palestine, 2 things. First of all, they were quite aware of Zionism as a movement and its claims on Palestine. And secondly, they were very, very strongly opposed to Zionism. In the end, what was kind of settled on at the Paris Peace Conference was something of a compromise, the mandatory system. And so this applied not only to the Arab territories of the former Ottoman Empire, but also to former colonies of Germany. So in essence, they would be colonies, primarily of Britain and France, though in the case of the Pacific, Japan in some cases. But in theory, at least, the British and French were supposed to prepare the local peoples for eventual self-government and independence, right? So these territories would be mandates of the British or mandates of the French, and the British and French had the responsibility to prepare them for eventual independence. This would be formalized at the San Remo Conference in 1920. In connection with the formation of a League of Nations that had actually been one of Wilson's 14 points. And so the British and French would be put in charge of the Arab territories of the former Ottoman Empire, but would have to periodically report to the League of Nations on their progress in preparing them for eventual independence. Syria, inclusive of what today is Lebanon, went to France. Iraq and Palestine, inclusive of present-day Jordan, went to Britain, and there would in fact be a truly independent Arab state, but it would only be in the Hijaz, the region immediately surrounding Mecca and Medina in Arabia. In the meantime, the Ottoman government would be forced to accept these arrangements as presented in the Treaty of Sèvres, which they signed in August 1920. But we'll have more on that later. So in theory, the Ottoman Empire is still around at this point, but it's become quite small. In fact, smaller than the present-day state of Turkey. So looking at the map here, right, one thing that becomes clear is that even though in theory Sykes-Picot was no longer legal as a secret treaty that had been negotiated without any consideration of the desires of the local peoples involved, the final settlement does very much correspond to it in terms of which territories France had wanted and which territories Britain had wanted. Right, so I mean there's some modification here, but we see Syria, inclusive of Lebanon, goes to France, and what would become Iraq and Palestine go to Britain. Probably the one major change is that, as we talked about earlier, what today constitutes Israel-Palestine had been an international zone. It was now under British control. So that reflected basically two things. First of all, that the British were militarily in control of it, so that gave them tremendous leverage to alter the arrangement. And second of all, because of their support of Zionism as per the Balfour Declaration, right? They would be there to facilitate the creation of a Jewish national home. And we'll talk later about what that actually entailed in practice. But in any event, this is what we have at the end of the First World War. And we do have a truly independent Arab state, but only in the territory of the Hijaz, a very small part of Arabia. And let's just say that this was considerably smaller than what the Arabs felt had been promised them in the Hussein McMahon correspondence. So there's going to be a tremendous feeling of bitterness about this, also about promises made in the Balfour Declaration and the fact that there had been a secret negotiation between Britain and France on how to divide up Arab territory. So we'll stop there and pick up with the next lecture.